Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS Webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I am pleased to be your host for today's broadcast, which is being co-produced with the Division of Chemical Health and Safety. Our moderator for today is Ralph Stuart, the former chair of the ACS Committee on Chemical Safety and the membership chair of the Division of Chemical Health and Safety. He received his BS from Cornell University and MS in Environmental Engineering from the University of Vermont. Is currently serving at Keene State College as the Chemical Hygiene Officer. And with that, Ralph, I will turn it over to you to get us started today.
Thank you, Mike. The ACS Division of Chemical Health and Safety is very pleased to help develop laboratory safety teams, which we like to call LSTs, on their campuses. With us today are four leaders in this work: Sarah Zinn, Jessica Martin, Kelly Miller, and Monica Nyansa, who are going to be talking to you about their experiences with laboratory safety teams and the ACS Division's Chemical Health and Safety's workshop, Empowering Academic Researchers to Strengthen Safety Culture. Kicking us off today will be Sarah to give us an introduction to LSTs.
Thanks, Ralph. So, in recent years, teams of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers have become involved with lab safety leadership as a way of improving and promoting a positive safety culture within their departments and their institutions. These teams have come to be called laboratory safety teams, or LSTs for short. The actual structure and the objectives of LSTs can vary widely within academic institutions, but the common goal is really to offer a bottom-up approach to address systemic safety challenges that are identified by the frontline researchers themselves. The LST movement continues to grow across academic institutions, especially within the US, as more frontline researchers become aware of this approach to addressing some of these more long-standing lab safety issues. But as the spread of LSTs across the US continues, the question has been asked: what is driving busy graduate students and postdoctoral researchers to spend time developing and implementing these teams? Why would students find value in spending their time and their mental resources pursuing such efforts when the pressure to publish and graduate is so strong? Often, the proclivity is to view the foundational motivation for these teams in a fundamentally positive light. Maybe students with an interest in safety, they wish to spread that interest, or students who have experienced particularly good safety mentorship, they want to be more involved. But the more that we talk to the leaders of these teams, the more that we actually realize that often their motivation stems from difficulties that they've personally experienced, specifically in their lab spaces. There are multiple teams within these stories, of course, but one of the most prominent ones that we've encountered involves productivity losses that are due to inefficient organizational systems. So today we're bringing together the stories of four leaders in this space who realized through conversations that there was a commonality in their experiences. And we're wondering, do these stories ring a familiar bell for you? So the first researcher to share her story will be Dr. Jessica Martin.
Thank you, Sarah. So, hello, I'm Jessica Martin, and before coming to graduate school, I had worked in a USD lab for over 3 years. I also had opportunities to do some project work with companies using their lab spaces. In both of these situations, I had experienced very well organized labs. Things were generally easy to find, and assembling what I needed to run my experiments was trivial in these environments. Then I entered my graduate school lab in an academic department. Now, I'm going to share with you one story from my graduate school lab experience. Suffice it to say, I have loads of others. So when I first started getting to know my lab, I found over 100 little bottles that had various types of powders in them, all completely unlabeled. They took up an entire shelf in a negative 20 degrees Celsius freezer. In an attempt to liberate this space, I started asking around about these samples so that we could get rid of them. It turned out that these samples were left behind by a lab group that had previously occupied our lab. All of those people had been gone for years, including the PI. As a result, there was nobody present who actually knew anything about these samples. The initial solution to this was to gather them all together and shove them in a fridge we weren't really using. Except, of course, now I needed to use it. I described the situation to a few different people in our EH&S department in order to figure out what to do about them. And I was given two options. One, give all of the samples to EHS to dispose of as unknown chemicals. Now, if I did this, there would likely be a massive fee that they would be passing on to my lab group to pay. Or two, I could spend my time and my lab's resources to go through and attempt to solubilize each sample and take an NMR in order to try to determine what was in the bottles, then put them into the proper waste containers. Given the number of samples, this would take many hours of work and would cost my lab group money for the NMR time and the solvents. Now think about that for a minute. My lab group did not create these samples. We had nothing to do with their existence. Also, when my PI came to the university, shouldn't he have been given clean labs to start with? So what this has effectively meant is that those unlabeled samples sit in the Neg 20 freezer to this day. So I'd like to find out from our audience right now how often this has happened to you. Have you ever actually had to deal with disposal of legacy samples or chemicals?
Now, unfortunately, this is somewhat of a runaway with 89% of respondents saying yes, 9% said no, and 2% said not applicable.
So, after all of the conversations that I have had within academia, it doesn't surprise me at all that 89% said they've absolutely had to deal with something like this before. So, thank you so much for sharing that within our poll. Now, this one example of many longstanding safety issues that existed, this is only one example of many of longstanding issues that existed in my lab. And what has cropped up repeatedly as a source of frustration for me has been the money and organizational issues around safety. It is one thing to train graduate students to function safely in a lab. It is quite another to ask a graduate student to spend their time and the lab group's money to try to resolve these long-standing issues. The reason these end up being long-standing issues is that the time commitment to resolve them is unwieldy for a graduate student trying to get through their programs. Also, forcing cash-strapped labs to make decisions about whether or not to spend money on the research or on long-standing safety issues strikes me as incredibly unfair. Let's face it, no one is going to give me a PhD for having organized freezers. What this means is that any initiative or personal responsibility that I exhibited to clean up the legacy messes in my lab was time being taken away from me for the research that would lead to my doctorate. And since there was a clear history of this type of work not being valued, it was also unlikely that any of these efforts would be maintained by others while I was there or after I left. And this is exactly why I think the establishment of an LST is important. By enabling leadership from graduate and postdoctoral researchers, we can bring our peers together and intentionally discuss these issues. We can find out what issues are just a matter of connecting people to the right resources that already exist, and what issues are not being addressed by current resource allocation. This also gives us the opportunity as graduate researchers to practice thinking about how to improve the safe operations of our labs. This is a critical skill to develop while in these programs, so that we have this skill when we move on to running labs of our own, whether in academia, government, or industry. Additionally, we are all too easily dismissed as individuals. There is power to be had in a collective. The power in this collective not only applies to your own department, but also applies across departments and across universities. This is also why it has been vital to talk to graduate students tackling these issues at other institutions. And in that spirit, I will now hand the mic over to our next researcher, Dr. Kaylee Miller, to share her story of what led her to LSTs.
My story for why I became involved in student lab safety teams has two parts. But before I start, I'd like to say that there can be a hesitancy sometimes to share these stories about safety because we don't want to feel like we're outing our place of work as an unsafe space. But as we saw from our last poll, it's actually important to realize that most of these problems are common in all academic institutions, and through open communication about these common issues, we are making it a safer space. So these are really difficult problems to solve, and it will take a lot of smart people putting their minds together to drive change. So for the first story, I will preface it by saying in undergrad, I had gained experience working both with established and developing safety programs at Dow Corning internships and a small nanochemistry startup, kind of like Jessica, where they have pretty established safety protocols. And when I started my PhD at the University of Illinois in a research group, I was the only chemist among other chemical and materials engineers. So with my safety experience and my scientific background, it was natural that I became the lab manager after my first year. And in the lab that I was in, every grad student had to go through this series of online trainings before working in the lab, and they had to be renewed each year. And in addition, we had several lab-specific trainings led by super users that were in charge of maintaining the SOPs, scheduling, upkeep. So on paper, the training system actually seems like a really good system, and most of the time it was. However, there's a lot of there wasn't a lot of documentation or training for those claiming leadership roles like I was going into. So it's a very learn as you go kind of approach. So things inevitably slip through the cracks. For example, I think probably I got through over a year in my role before finding out what and where our university chemical hygiene plan was. And in addition, my responsibilities were fully outlined in a way that was obvious to me. So I didn't know that we had to do, for example, eye wash and fire extinguisher checks until after my first lab audit when we didn't have records over the past year. So that kind of boggled my mind because I'm coming from a place where I was pretty motivated to do a good job, and you seemingly have this very good infrastructure, and then there's because of some disconnect, there was a major thing missed, even though you have the best intentions. So that got my gears turning. How does this happen? So my second example is about chemical organization, and through several different annual audits and mid-year check-ins, we had a recurring violation of keeping updated lists of chemicals and or hazards present in each lab. The other chemistry building created an inventory program to keep up with this, and so they would have barcodes, and people would go to the building once a year to update it. But because my research building wasn't in a primary chemistry building and was actually a collaborative research center, we did not have this system. So I've spent a lot of time working with our facilities and the HNS staff to come up with solutions. And we went through and pulled every chemical out and reorganized our storage, making sure things were properly contained and had compatibilities, and limiting the amount of flammable liquids in one room. And I could go on. And so this was probably one of my biggest projects outside of my research. And in the end, we were able to create this cloud-based list of chemicals in our labs, but it's questionable if it was kept up after I left. And again, I find myself asking how this happened. How was it that I was, in charge of this? So those are my two stories. And to see how many of you the second story resonates, I will turn this over to Michael for the poll.
And our second poll question for everyone is, have you ever had to work with poorly maintained or non-existent chemical inventory system? And your possible responses are yes, or no, or that this question isn't applicable to you. And it looks like this is another runaway question, with 91% saying yes, 7% saying no, and 1% saying not applicable.
So thanks for those of you that have participated in the poll. We kind of picked these because we thought most people would have shared experiences. And I could go on for a while about reasons that I've become more and more interested in academic lab safety. But for me, it seems like recurring problems that I've seen are a lack of communication and a lack of acknowledging the prevalence of human error. So if you think about how these goals are structured in these environments, what's important is to really understand how to make it easy for people to do the things they're supposed to do, and in many cases, things that they want to do, rather than hoping someone will remember things from an online training 4 years ago, or assuming they'll be able to find resources on their own to help them do their job. So if you think of my stories, the faculty and staff really did try and help develop systems that were sustainable, but there was a disconnect in the end with how workers actually go about their day. And it's easy at this point to become defeated or to give up because there's this huge time commitment that was given, and still improvements are needed at the end. So solving these problems does take a lot of trial and error and persistence on the part of both students and faculty. And the solutions that work are totally dependent on the unique environment at each institution. So something that really helped was getting involved in safety groups to see what others did to solve similar problems. I helped launch the safety team at my institution, even though I didn't hold one of the executive leadership positions. I was also appointed to the National ACS Committee on Chemical Safety and volunteered with this group at the ACS Division of Chemical Safety. And in these groups, I wanted to contribute my expertise, but noticed there wasn't a lot of work being done in this space. So I created this workshop to connect people and develop future leaders like Jessica and Sarah and Monica. So knowing the workshop is in good hands, I kind of sit on the sidelines more. But in my current role, I work for Stanford University as a shared facilities research safety specialist. But I try to be involved in any way that I can because these are still so relevant in my current role. All right, with that, I will be turning it over to the next researcher to share her story, Sarah Zinn.
Thanks, Kaylee. Like others here, my journey to working with safety teams is rooted very deeply in personal experiences and a drive to improve conditions. So, I'm a first generation STEM major and a first generation graduate student. I entered graduate school kind of starry eyed and intimidated. And I also had wildly inaccurate expectations, which were calibrated to the overly positive public facing front that's kind of depicted here in the slide. So when I first joined my group, I was pretty struck by how inefficiently everything ran, how dirty everything was, and how little anything was documented. Learning pretty much anything in my lab was entirely through word of mouth from senior students to junior students. We didn't have inventory of our chemicals, of our equipment, or of our laser optics. I was starting a new project in the lab, and I wasn't working with a senior student on this project. So it was up to me to go through our lab, drawer by drawer, cabinet by cabinet, and take stock of what we had and what we didn't have so that I could purchase what I needed. So, in an attempt to help my lab function more smoothly, I inventoried everything as I went. I created an online searchable chemical inventory for our group. But it wasn't just our inventory system that stood in my way. Our space, especially our hoods, was very disorganized and dirty. Hot plates were on and unused for who knows how long. Tubing had fallen and melted on the hot plates and on the bench. Unknown substances were in the hood and on the counter in old unlabeled beakers. And the waste disposal was poorly documented, it was full, and it was confusing. Since I was going to be spending most of my foreseeable future in this space, I spent much of my entire second year cleaning up this legacy mess. A year into joining the group, I was struggling to keep up with the work that would actually get me my PhD because I was constantly trying to maintain our shared space, and I found myself mostly alone in my attempts. I couldn't work in the environment that I was in, but I was also only harming myself by spending exorbitant amounts of time trying to maintain a functional space in an environment that wasn't obviously valued work. Meanwhile, the time for annual online safety training would come around again, and everyone I knew, and even myself, would skip to the quiz at the end and kind of check that administrative box. Annual lab inspections would roll around, and everyone would spend the week before throwing unknown legacy samples into drawers and otherwise cleaning up the lab space just enough to pass inspection and then forget about it for the rest of the year. So this really made me wonder, how common is this situation? So I'm going to ask you about your experiences, and I'll turn it over to Michael to launch a quiz.
How often have you encountered a disruptive equipment mess or chemical contamination that was produced by a previous occupant of your lab space? Was it too many times? A few times? Never? Or this question isn't applicable to you? This one isn't quite as much as a runaway, with 60% saying too many times, 32% saying a few times, 6% saying never, lucky you, and 2% saying not applicable.
So those results don't really surprise me from conversations that I've had in my institutions. That's kind of along the lines of what I've experienced too. So it was at this point in my journey where I started considering how widespread this issue was that I realized that this is really more of a systemic issue that needs addressing on a much larger scale than just in my own lab space. So I have so much company in this experience, and I wouldn't really be able to make a dent, let alone a long-term improvement, just by temporarily cleaning up the lab space that I inherited. This goes beyond individuals. I think it comes down to finding solutions and structures that work for the people who are actually using them. So, to try to make more of a long term efficient change, I co founded our lab safety team to try to address these issues in a way that I, as a graduate student, could actually accomplish. A lot of what I was seeing on the ground was a mismatch between what researchers need and what they experience and what information they have, a mismatch with that from what administration wants and needs and the administrative structure. So I really saw lab safety teams as a way to bridge that mismatch and a way to bring the safety needs of researchers to the table. I saw it as a good space a good accessible space that was visible to students, where we could talk about and address the practical issues that we actually experience day to day in our labs. For me, it was a place to start visibly having these conversations and a place where all of our different motivations and interests could crystallize into a common goal. So, with that, I'd like to hand it over to our last speaker today, Monica Nyansa, to share a bit about the experiences that have led her to getting involved with LST.
Okay, so my story is pretty much similar to everything you've heard so far. So when I started graduate school, that was in 2018, I found myself in a lab where both people I met were in their final year. And so they were almost out of the door. I got the opportunity to watch them work and also to work with them. I mean, one thing I realized immediately was how poor the housekeeping in the lab was. That I kept questioning if there was any time they stopped to clean up the lab during their entire period in the lab they were working in. But it became obvious to me that that wasn't the situation. And then there was my first safety inspection by EHS, which is an annual inspection. And I was so eager to clean the lab because to me, I thought that was part of the reason for the inspection. When I started figuring out how to properly get rid of some things in the lab, one of the senior lab members just told me to shove them in the drawers. Hiding things in the drawers because the safety professionals are not going to go through them didn't sit well with me, but that is what I did. After the inspection, the safety reports on their findings and what needed to be fixed in the lab, safety-wise, came to my then advisor in a long email. When the report came in, the other student was also leaving, and hence I was the only one left in the lab. And that meant I had to spend most of my first and second year cleaning up the lab and bringing it to some acceptable safety standard. This included getting rid of waste, making an inventory system for the chemicals, making hard copies for SOPs we used in the lab, cleaning the fridge, and labeling stuff. It was nice having the EHS department help me out with what to do when I had a question about waste management and how to discard chemicals in general. While I am proud of the work that I did to make this lab safe for future grad students, this work also robbed me of considerable time when I should have been preparing for teaching, studying for my own classes, and working on my research. Also, given that good housekeeping was never a big part of the lab, I suspected that as soon as I was gone, none of the work I had done would be reviewed or maintained. And then I started running experiments in the lab. I quickly realized how lonely and tough it was to not know much about the safety of what you are doing. Most of my chemical safety knowledge at that point was from the safety course, which is mandatory for all first year grad students in our department. When I needed help with the experimental portion, I could consult with my colleagues in other organic labs to help me with it. But we never really discussed the safety aspect of the experiment. Looking back and knowing what I know now, I'm sure there were many things I did on the advice of my colleagues that were unsafe or unwise. Since we had all been through the same limited safety training, we all had similar gaps in our knowledge. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mike to handle the poll for this section.
For our final poll, have you ever contacted safety professionals for help with specific questions about research safety or hazardous waste issues in your lab? And your possible responses are yes, they were helpful. Yes, they were not helpful. No, I haven't needed them. Or no, I don't know anyone I can contact. And finally, not applicable. Luckily, 72%, the largest portion, said yes, they were helpful. 9% said they were not helpful. 7% said no, they haven't needed them. 5% said no, they don't know anyone they can contact. And 7% said not applicable.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I am really glad to see that a lot of people get help when they contact EHS because they can be really good allies when it comes to safety, your safety in the lab. This got me thinking about how my experience can't be an isolated incident. What if there are others within the department in similar situations? How do we help each other to safely do the science we love so much? And then our new department chair sponsored several graduate students, me included, to attend the ACS Chemical Health and Safety Workshop on empowering academic researchers to strengthen safety culture. That group, which attended this workshop and were inspired by the stories that were shared, started having safety related discussions together with the department chair, the chemical hygiene officer of the department, and EHS personnel, which has become a monthly meeting now, and formally now an LST, which is a lab safety team. I believe this provides us with a platform as graduate students to have a united voice and also to learn from each other when it comes to safety. I finally changed labs for other reasons. And in my new lab, I started conversations related to safety with my new lab mates, which includes something as simple as telling each other the reactions we are running and some of the associated risks, as well as discussing safety issues present in the lab as a way of creating and maintaining a strong, positive local lab culture, which we can then share with other labs within the department. So with that, I will hand it over to Jessica Martin.
Thank you, Monica. Now, first, I want to thank this group of researchers for being willing to publicly share their struggles here today. When sharing our stories with one another, we realized that all of us had experienced our research productivity being undermined by housekeeping challenges that had gotten out of control long before we had arrived. We all had expectations that we were entering our graduate research labs to learn how to be effective researchers, and that this training would include how to effectively manage a lab to support research productivity. However, it quickly became clear that our individual labs were not where we were going to learn these vital lessons. And as we talked to more and more graduate researchers, we also discovered that these challenges were not isolated to our specific labs. Housekeeping challenges are a systemic issue throughout academic research labs, and the people who suffer most from these challenges are the frontline graduate and postdoctoral researchers. Both their limited time and their personal health and safety are impacted by poor lab-wide housekeeping. Now, as the frontline researchers working in these labs, we are the experts on how these challenges disrupt our progress. However, as temporary workers within this system, we control neither the resources nor the rules that are needed to address these challenges. While there are many safety professionals who would not be surprised by the stories we shared above, we have found that even though most of the problems are often acknowledged as systemic, proposed solutions are still only focused on individual actions. So LSTs have functioned as a vehicle to bring together graduate and postdoctoral researchers to share their experience with one another so that they can discover what particular issues are systemic within their departments. This has functioned differently from those faculty committees to which one or two graduate researchers are invited. While this may appear to be representation, graduate researchers on these committees typically have the least power, the least influence, and can easily be intimidated into silence. An LST changes this dynamic, allowing graduate researchers to find their voice among their peers struggling with the same challenges. Engaged safety professionals and faculty members have functioned as champions for LSTs, taking the issues identified by LSTs seriously and securing the audiences and resources necessary to begin to address these systemic issues. The issues identified are typically not easy to address. If they were easy to address, then they would have been resolved long ago. However, this working relationship between LSTs and their champions is creating a space in which graduate and postdoctoral researchers are learning how to identify safety issues in their lab and ask for help. And champions are learning what broader issues actually do undermine safety in research labs and how to address them more effectively. So we are also working with CHAS to develop ways for graduate and postdoctoral researchers to talk to one another about these issues across universities. Dr. Kaylee Miller mentioned the workshop she founded and led on behalf of CHAS to be conducted at the ACS National Meeting in 2018. We have created a page on the CHAS website sharing the history and development of this workshop shown here. I began working with her to continue this workshop starting in 2019. So I took over as the leader of these workshops just as the COVID lockdown forced the cancellation of in-person events. Instead of throwing in the towel, I worked with a group of graduate students as the workshop leader to redevelop this workshop to be delivered virtually. Sarah then played a major role in that redevelopment and won, as part of this team of graduate students, the first ever CHAS Graduate Student Safety Leadership Award in 2021 in recognition of this work, as well as the work she was doing leading her LST at her own institution. Monica Nyansa began supporting the workshop starting in the beginning of 2021 and will be taking over as workshop leader for the workshops in 2022. The workshop will continue to be held virtually 3 times per year. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this workshop, you can visit the CHAS workshops page on the CHAS website and uh, look for the one called Empowering Academic Researchers to Strengthen Safety Culture. Additionally, Monica has worked with division leaders to curate another page on the site called Lab Safety Team Resources in order to gather together useful publications for those interested in starting or strengthening their own LSTs. Finally, we have started a workspace on Slack called Lab Safety Teams, where LST leaders from all over can communicate and share ideas. Thank you for attending this webinar and listening to our stories, as well as answering our polls to share your stories as well. And we're happy to answer your questions.
Somebody says that they're interested in developing a student-led lab safety team on their campus. What do you think is a good first step in that process?
Thank you, Raf. So I would say the first step will be to let them attend the ACS Chemical Health and Safety Workshop because, I mean, personally, that is how I got involved with everyone who is on this webinar today. And it has been a really useful resource, like where to even start from. And I would also suggest that since you are willing to support these students, be willing to be a champion for them because most times you need for LSTs to really function, you need a champion. You need somebody who is willing to advocate for these teams. You need somebody who is willing to support, who is willing to give advice, and who is willing to protect these grad students, I mean, in certain situations. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, a great way to get started with LSTs too is actually the workshop that Jessica mentioned. So encouraging students to go together and attend this workshop and kind of hear other stories from LST leaders and get a checklist of next steps. I think that's a great place to start.
Jessica, so it sounds like one of your driving forces to get involved is housekeeping, chemical inventory. Are there other kinds of hazards that arose as the work went forward and that you were sort of called on to address as a lab safety team?
Sure. We focused a lot on talking about housekeeping because in so many situations, it really is the root of all of the other accidents that happen. We had a lot of issues within our department in which we talked about accidentally flooding labs, right? Where we talked about accidentally setting things on fire, where we talked about people slipping and falling and injuring themselves really badly when things got put together in a hood that weren't supposed to be put together, and now you've got a fire, right? Like the root cause of all of these things is that stuff just isn't being put back where it belongs. And then things just aren't being cleaned up. And if it was being cleaned up, it just feels like over 90% of those things wouldn't happen. The example with flooding labs. One of my fellow lab mates did this. He didn't use the correct clamps on the tubing. Why? He couldn't find them. Okay, he couldn't find them in our disastrous, messy lab, and the stockroom was already closed downstairs. He was having to work on the weekend. He just wanted to get it done, and that is repeated over and over and over again. It's not that they're dumb and don't know. It's that they were just hoping it would work. And let's face it, most of the time it does, right? Most of the time it doesn't result in a flood. And so you can usually get away with it. That's one of the reasons why so many of us are harping on this idea of really focusing on housekeeping, because you can eliminate so many hazards simply by putting things away and cleaning things up and having an organized process to do that.
Kelly, how can lab safety teams complement services provided by institutional environmental health and safety staff?
I think it's important to emphasize that in this structure that the student LST isn't looking to step into like a responsible training function like faculty members or to take responsibility for environmental health and safety compliance functions. So these teams are meant to function in addition to and in collaboration with both of these pre-existing structures. So unfortunately, depending on like the size of the EHMS team and the funding they have available and the emphasis of being involved in safety amongst faculty, the support that those groups can provide, maybe more or less. So student safety teams have differing structures and different objectives, depending on the institution's organizations and needs and resources. So overall, these tend to focus on improving the culture of safety and in research-intensive science departments. So that involves enabling leadership by graduate student and postdoctoral associate lab safety officers, and just getting everyone to communicate together, like we had said. I think in Jessica's closing.
Yeah, I've always been an institutional EHS professional myself, and it's been an ongoing challenge to connect to the grad students because they are so busy with so many responsibilities, and so people willing to take on this work is really valuable to those of us doing that role as well. Sarah, do you think that this model could be used in the classroom setting, for example, for graduate student teaching assistants or for the students in the class to help them improve their safety performance?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a number of different ways that these types of programs could be implemented specifically in classrooms. So, one possibility is for, the LST that exists already within the greater department to interface with teaching assistants in classrooms directly. So some existing LSTs already have these kinds of programs. For example, some are working to enhance the way that safety is taught to undergraduates. Some are engaging teaching assistants directly in how to respond to incidents in the teaching lab in a way that's motivated by peer experience. Some have peer-to-peer workshopping with teaching assistants about how to begin and follow through with conversations about safety behavior to their students. But another possibility might be to actually adapt these types of LSTs, these types of hands-on peer-led programs specifically for the classroom. So this approach has actually been reported, I think, in the Journal of Chemical Education for a program that was developed at Seattle University. Um, so in that program, they really tried to make a classroom focused form of an LST where students worked together as a cohesive group to lead uh, pre-lab presentations on safety, to monitor lab practices while the lab was occurring, and then also to inspect their lab spaces post-lab. So I definitely encourage anyone who's interested in adapting the LST model specifically for classrooms to look at that JChemEd paper. I think it was published in 2010.
Yeah. And if I may add to that, this isn't necessarily classroom based, but one of the follow-on impacts we had once we started to organize as an LST and really have these conversations in terms of what mentorship did we wish we had, what organizational structure did we wish we had. The undergraduate researchers that came into our labs became the guinea pigs, to start experimenting with whether this worked out well or not. And for us, it was also just incredibly revelatory and a great thing to document to prove to others in the system that it really is about just providing a good example. Undergraduate researchers coming into the lab, they're very rarely there to be rebellious, right? They're there to find out what it is to be a researcher, and they're looking at you, the graduate student, to teach them. And then the graduate student is looking at their PI and not necessarily getting a whole lot of guidance depending on who your PI is. And so this idea that we're defying safety rules because we're all just rebellious and crazy, it has nothing to do with that. It very little to do with it. We really are looking at what we're supposed to be doing and trying to be good scientists. So there's a lot to be said for how people are showing others what a good scientist looks like.
Monica, somebody wonders, do you think it's advisable to separate safety leadership in a lab from the more general responsibilities of a laboratory manager?
That's a good question. I mean, I will let Kinley comment on that later because she's been a lab manager before. But I don't think that is two different things to be separated. I mean, a lab manager um sort of see over have control, sort of sees everything, like the overall activities in the lab. And that also includes safety, like making sure that people are working safely and having the all the PPEs that they need to do their work. Okay. And I know in recent years, there's been the lab safety officers positions where there's a lab that chooses one person who makes sure that the lab is sort of up to safety standard. Like you are not acting like a policing people around, but making sure that the hazardous waste are taken out on time, that people have the PPEs that they need, that people, that SOPs, there are SOPs for all the things that people are doing. So I think lab manager is big. It's like it's somebody who is in charge of the lab, making sure equipment are working, like everything, including safety, is working. But as a researcher who is also working with chemicals in different equipment that comes with safety issues, I think
Oh,
have that safety. It's not something to skills to a researcher.
yeah, that was a really great description. I think the only thing I'll add is that a lot of the time I've seen, so a lot of the time you'll have lab managers and even the lab safety officers be part of the leadership team. It's actually uh, kind of, you could see it like a funnel, for training for people that, first they're involved as a lab safety officer, and then they learn some and they want to get involved in the bigger organizational. I think that's more commonly how it happens. But if your lab already has a safety officer and you also want to be involved in safety, there's nothing stopping you from doing that as well. So and some labs don't have lab managers. Some labs have both a lab manager and safety officers. So it really just depends on your interests and the lab's interests, and how it's structured.
I also did just want to add to this. The way that this terminology gets used, depending on what kind of your lab you're in, it was very interesting for me. When I was working in the lab I was in at the USDA, we had a lab manager. It was her full time job to be a lab manager. So when we needed things ordered, we went to her. When inspections needed to be organized, we went to her. She was also responsible for the training of all of the researchers in the lab. Now, having her exist didn't somehow vanquish my responsibilities for safety, right? So it was not her job to follow me around and clean up after me. That was my job. But because everybody knew that was their job, people did clean up after themselves and alerted to her to anything that they needed. And so if we had something not working, we went to go talk to her about it. And she got things organized. Now, coming into academia, of course, you're seeing very different organizational structures, and that some people do have full-time staff lab managers. I did not work in a department that was like that at all. And so this idea that a graduate student is going to be assigned this role, um, it sounds very daunting to me without at least without something giving somewhere, you know. And just in terms of the demands on their time. I was also in a department where most students were teaching assistants for their stipends. And so we all had heavy teaching schedules. We all had heavy, we had our classes to take for the first years, and then we had to do our research. On top of this, giving somebody that role to be the lab manager, if you're going to give them that broader role, some other responsibility needs to go away. And it just doesn't seem fair to layer that on top of that graduate student, on top of everything else.
Yeah, I think I'd also like to add that there's a portion to this that comes with a high turnover rate in academia. So if you're trying to make the lab manager position somebody like a graduate student, um, who kind of comes and goes on a short term relative to the lifespan of the lab, I think it is something that needs to be considered, not necessarily, separating safety leadership from the lab manager role, but maybe separating organizational structure of what it means to be, a lab manager from the actual position. So maybe, implementing some things that are more long lived or long term than just the individual in the position. So that they can come in and there's a very documented, onboarding and offboarding procedure, and things like that if you're going to have a high turnover rate of lab managers.
It's a very good point. I just want to append to that. The one person who isn't high turnover in that lab is the PI, right?
Well, PI has 6 years to not be high turnover if they're under pressure during that period. Um, Jessica, what, if any, is the gender breakdown of the researchers who are participating in the LSTs? As a safety professional, the person who's asking the question is sensitive to recognizing that the majority role women play in the non-promotable tasks associated with lab work. If there's a gender discrepancy, how can we start to address that?
So first of all, while I know you're looking at 4 women on this call today, um, we've actually found across a lot of different teams that the disparity is not quite this extreme, right? There are actually quite a few males who are also involved in the LST movement. Some of the explanation for that, I do think, is the fact that a lot of people come to LSTs in addition to the things that we've talked about, because we have heard the rumors that industry cares, and that we do need to make sure that in some way we are proving on our CVs that we have taken safety seriously, we have gotten the training, and it does matter. And I've certainly, like I've observed, I don't have hard numbers on this, but I have observed that the places where there are companies that are saying, yes, this matters to us. And so Dow is a big one. ExxonMobil down south is another one. um, you will see more male involvement, which I don't think is good, bad, or indifferent. It is, and it's it makes sense, right? To put time and effort into something that is ultimately going to get you a job, um, as it should be. I'm glad that that's the uh, influence that they're having here, right? In terms of balancing things out, I mean, I think a big part of this is where champions can really step in, and where it is important to really utilize and take advantage of these teams for what they are. As Ralph had mentioned earlier, these teams can be really useful for the EH&S professional. While EH&S professionals are pulled a million different ways, and they have to cover so many different things, having a group of researchers to come together and say, these are the trainings we actually need, could be incredibly useful, and in some starting ways is useful at now my alma mater. That we're really starting to communicate that so that we can make safety training more useful. And I think once you build more utility into that, you're going to attract more researchers generally, and you probably will attract more male researchers relative to female researchers as a result.
Yeah, I'd like to that was all great. I'd like to just add also that I think a lot of schools now are looking at um, how to acknowledge the work that is being done by these people more. Like give them a stipend in addition, because it's unrecognized work a lot of the time, and even they're fighting against people that think it's a waste of time. So giving them more power, more authority in any way that you can in the university is one thing that probably will help quite a bit, if we are talking about gender imbalance, because or I think awards or grants or something like that, some kind of time where they're put in a place where they're sufficiently acknowledged for their work.
Thank you both for sharing those thoughts. So we sort of pointed in the direction that people are asking about is how do you manage the people that are the lab safety team is usually not does not have administrative responsibilities. I think somebody said that it sort of disclaimed this administrative responsibilities. How do you manage administration who may have other priorities than housekeeping or safety training or whatever?
Yeah, I'll take this question if I understand it correctly. And I also saw some other questions, asked in the chat about principal investigators and people who maybe aren't so interested in this space, and make it perhaps difficult for people to get involved in such administrative things. And I think it really comes down to motivation. So I think really everybody is motivated to engage in these kinds of teams and this kind of administrative safety behavior, be, for different reasons. So, graduate students have different reasons to be motivated to engage in this kind of thing. But also, PIs do have a reason, even though it might not be obviously um, clear to them. As a society, we often don't talk about safety in this manner, but kind of, the whole point of our conversation today is that there's productivity losses to safety issues in the lab. And, even though PIs might not be in a headspace to recognize that or think about that, I think we can make it clear to them, and we can make the point that there are definitely productivity losses. And if we can work to make a better safety environment, and be involved in these kinds of higher level organizational teams, that in the long run we can increase the efficiency of your lab. And I think each of us professionals have a different motivation, but really just all coming together from different perspectives to achieve the same goal. I think it's just making that motivation clear from all different perspectives.
And I think that's one of the reasons that Chaz, as a technical division, is very interested in this work because I think what you just talked about is a safety culture, right? Is being able to bring different perspectives together in a functional way around a particular topic. And um, Chaz has been increasingly interested in safety culture as an object of study for the last 10 years. And I think that you guys have been very valuable in helping us to address that issue. So I think we're getting close to the end of the time. I'll just ask one more question here. Several people are asking about how do we identify the most sustainable opportunities for LSTs, systemic changes that are impactful and sustainable over time. Um, Kelly, do you want to take a stab at that one?
That's a hard question. I think that's the challenge that it might need to be a little bit trial and error, because there's a lot of things that these safety teams can do. And usually things that are like one off and led by the passion of one person are really good to pursue because, there's there's an overlap in the interest of the individual and of the group. But things to watch for is if it's consistently only one person that's not going to be sustainable. So something where it's addressing the needs that a lot of different labs have, things that overlap already with the work that people are going to be doing, things that they're going to be spending time on anyway. So this is why we talk about housekeeping or have talked about housekeeping throughout here, is because that is a huge time detraction, right? And so things like that will be useful no matter what. I'm kind of drawing a blank other than trial and error with these kinds of things. I don't know if any
Yeah,
of
we can
you
go to
all
that.
have more thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say definitely leveraging the growing network that exists between these LSTs that already exist. So, like Jessica Martin talked about, again the workshop, and then there's also the Slack channel that we have started where you can really talk to people who've been kind of knee deep in these things already and have done this trial and error already. You don't necessarily need to reinvent that wheel. So you can talk to people and see what has been done, what has worked for them, what kinds of structures they have, and what they've learned through those things. And I think, yeah, definitely leveraging existing information that's already out there through these networks is important. And there's also the growing literature on LST formation and different projects that different LSTs have done, and whether they've struggled with them or not. So there's a growing literature in ACS chemical health and safety about this too. So
Yeah.
definitely look at that.
Well, while you were talking, I realized also if you have support from your like faculty and administration, those are the things that are going to be far more likely to be successful because you have like top down support for programs versus bottom up. So when you can marry those two interests, those will be the most successful.
So I think we're getting ready to close here. We go around the table and just ask people for closing thoughts. Jessica?
Sure. This is to faculty and safety professionals. There's a lot of cool stuff that's been happening within the safety professional space, where ideas on this have been evolving over the last few decades. So this is a great time for these two groups to find each other and start talking. And I'll just say, graduate students care about these things more than they are typically given credit for. So let them into the conversation as partners. They may not have something to contribute initially, but by giving them verbal space and building trust, you'll soon find what I've found. And that's that there's all these just incredibly intelligent, highly perceptive, very dedicated individuals who are more than willing to be part of the solution.
Yeah, so I would say that in my experience, really the problems that you're facing, or that you feel like you're facing as an individual in your lab space, are probably much bigger and much more systemic than you initially think. So having conversations with people around you and being open and honest about the challenges that you faced, I think can only help everything improve from there.
Okay, so I'll say there is power in teamwork. Talk with your fellow grad students. Really, just start talking. You don't have to do this alone, please. It's a lot of work. So,
I'm going to just say the same thing. I mean, don't reinvent the wheel. And if there are other groups that do things that work, just take a little time to reach out and ask. But it's definitely worth it in the end.
Thank you for watching this presentation. ACS Webinars is provided as a service by the American Chemical Society as your professional source for live weekly discussions and presentations that connect you with subject matter experts and global thought leaders concerning today's relevant professional issues in the chemical sciences, management, and business.